1. Title confirmed. Family said, "You'll never belong at this table. The man at the head of it is my mentor." 2. Hook/thumbnail text confirmed. The Ashford Foundation gala is invitation only, brother said, blocking the entrance. You weren't on the list. Cousin Mark laughed. Not everyone belongs in these rooms. I stood quietly. Then Richard Ashford, founder, billionaire, keynote speaker, crossed the entire ballroom. He ignored every guest, stopped in front of me, and said, "I didn't think you'd make it. I saved your seat at the head table." Then I said 2 words that made my brother turn pale. 3. Thumbnail image prompt. Portrait of a black woman in her early 30s, wearing an elegant deep emerald evening gown with understated diamond earrings, composed expression with quiet dignity and a hint of vindication, standing at the threshold of a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and round gala tables blurred behind her, warm golden chandelier light with soft glowing bouquet, cinematic portrait, shallow depth of field, photorealistic. 16:9 YouTube thumbnail. 4. Full story. Adaeze Nwosu had worn the emerald dress exactly once before, to a small dinner 18 months earlier where Richard Ashford had introduced her, without warning, to a room full of foundation trustees as the person doing the actual work that makes the rest of us look good. She'd pulled it out of the closet that morning almost as an afterthought, not because she'd expected tonight to require armor, but because some part of her, packing for a family wedding weekend that happened to overlap with the Ashford Foundation's annual gala, had wanted something in her suitcase that reminded her of who she'd become in the 6 years since she'd stopped needing her family's permission for anything. She hadn't planned to attend the gala at all, originally. It had been an accident of scheduling, her cousin Priya's wedding in the same city, the same weekend, and Adaeze had told her research director, half joking, that she'd probably skip the gala this year to make the family event, and he'd looked at her like she'd suggested skipping her own dissertation defense. "Richard's doing the keynote," Marcus had said. "He's specifically asked if you're going to be there." Twice. So she'd worked it out. The wedding brunch that morning, a hotel room to change in, a car booked for 6:45 to get her to the Ashford Foundation's gala at the Highline Grand by 7:30. She hadn't told her family any of it, not because she was hiding something exactly, but because in 6 years of building a career her family had shown almost no curiosity about, she'd stopped expecting them to ask, and had stopped, mostly, offering. She should have known better than to think the 2 worlds could occupy the same city on the same night without colliding. The story of how Adaeze came to know Richard Ashford, founder of Ashford Capital, chairman of the Ashford Foundation, a man whose name appeared in business press with the kind of reverence usually reserved for people who'd fundamentally reshaped an industry, began 7 years earlier, in a windowless seminar room at the Public Policy graduate program where Adaeze had been, at the time, a second-year student running on savings and a partial fellowship, working nights at a call center to cover the gap. She'd applied for a research assistantship on a foundation-funded housing policy study almost as an afterthought, one of 40 applicants for a position she assumed she had no real shot at, given that most of the other applicants came from families with the kind of names that opened doors before a resume ever needed to. She'd gotten the position anyway, on the strength of a policy memo she'd written on housing voucher administration that had apparently crossed Richard Ashford's desk personally, an unusual occurrence, she'd later learn, since Richard rarely reviewed research assistant applications himself, but had happened to be in the office the week the shortlist came through and had read every submission out of what he described, later, as simple boredom with a board meeting that had run long. He'd called her personally to offer the position, which she'd assumed was standard practice until she started the job and realized the foundation's program director had never once received a call like that from Richard in 4 years of running the fellowship. "Your memo," he told her in that first phone call, was the only one that actually understood the difference between a policy that sounds good and a policy that survives contact with a caseworker's Tuesday afternoon. Most people who write about housing policy have never once sat across from someone trying to navigate it. Adaeze had sat across from many people trying to navigate it. Her own mother had spent 4 years, when Adaeze was a child, cycling through subsidized housing waitlists after her father left, For years, Adaeze remembered with a specific, unglamorous clarity of childhood hardship. The caseworkers who lost paperwork, the apartments that fell through at the last minute, the particular exhaustion on her mother's face at the end of each bureaucratic dead end. She'd written that memo, in part, out of the accumulated fury of having watched her mother navigate a system that seemed designed to exhaust rather than help. She'd never told Richard the personal history behind the memo, not in that first call, not for the first 2 years of working for him. It had simply never come up in a way that felt natural, and by the time it might have, the omission had started to feel like its own kind of decision. Over the following 7 years, the relationship had deepened into something neither of them had fully planned for. Richard had funded the remainder of her graduate program without her asking. He'd hired her, upon her graduation, into a senior research role at the foundation, and had promoted her twice since, until she now ran the foundation's entire housing policy division, a role that put her in rooms with legislators and agency heads and, increasingly, other foundations looking to replicate what she'd built. He'd become, somewhere in those 7 years, something closer to a mentor in the fullest sense of the word. Not just a professional benefactor, but a person who asked real questions about her life, who remembered her mother's name, who had once flown to Detroit on 4 hours' notice when Adaeze called him, shaking, from a hospital waiting room where her mother had been admitted for what turned out to be a minor cardiac event, simply because he didn't want her sitting there alone. None of that had ever made its way back to Adaeze's family. Her parents, divorced since she was 9, her father largely absent since, had never fully recovered from the specific economic instability of Adaeze's childhood, and had built, in the years since, a family culture that prized visible, immediate markers of stability above almost everything else. Her older brother Chitty had gone into corporate law, made partner at 34, and had become, in the family's eyes, the standard against which everyone else's choices were measured. Her cousin Mark, Priya's brother, ran a successful real estate development firm and had never once let a family gathering pass without some reference to his latest deal. Adaeze's work, something with nonprofits, as her mother described it to relatives, the same vague, faintly apologetic phrase Adaeze had heard applied to her career for nearly a decade, had never registered on the family's scale of legible success, no matter how many times she'd tried to explain the actual shape and weight of what she did. She'd stopped trying, mostly, around the time Chitty made partner, and the family's collective attention narrowed almost entirely onto celebrating his trajectory, leaving Adaeze quieter, harder to explain work to exist in the margins of every family conversation, mentioned briefly, and then set aside for something more immediately impressive. The wedding brunch that Saturday morning had gone the way most family gatherings went, warm in the surface ways, chilly in the ways that mattered, Adaeze absorbing a steady undercurrent of comparison she'd learned, over the years, to let slide past her without visible reaction. Chitty had spent much of the brunch discussing a case his firm had just won, a genuine professional triumph that Adaeze was happy for him about, uncomplicatedly, even as she noted the particular attention the family gave it, the way conversation orbited around him for a solid 20 minutes, while her own updates about the foundation's work got a polite, brief acknowledgement before moving on. It was Mark, near the end of brunch, who'd first mentioned the gala, not realizing or not caring that Adaeze was in the room. "The Ashford Foundation gala is tonight," he said to Chitty, with the particular excitement of a man discussing an opportunity he considered important. "I got us on the list through a client connection. Richard Ashford's doing the keynote. This is the kind of room you need to be in if you want the kind of clients I'm chasing next year." "You got tickets?" Chitty asked, genuinely impressed.
"2.
"Cost me a favor I'll be paying off for a year, but it's worth it. Richard Ashford doesn't do many public appearances anymore. This is a room full of exactly the people I need to know." Adaeze had said nothing, had simply continued eating her eggs, weighing whether this was a moment worth correcting or another one worth letting pass. She decided, somewhere in the silence, that it wasn't worth the effort of explaining, that Mark's excitement about getting on the list for an event she attended as a matter of routine, an event where she'd be seated at the head table by virtue of running the foundation's largest program division, wasn't a battle she needed to fight over brunch eggs at her cousin's wedding. She hadn't accounted for the possibility that Mark and Chitty would decide, later that evening, to try their luck at the door. She arrived at the Highline Grand at 7:31, 1 minute later than planned, her emerald dress a stark contrast against the plain overnight bag she'd swapped for a small clutch in the hotel elevator, and found, standing at the entrance to the ballroom, an unmistakable and unwelcome tableau: her brother Chitty and her cousin Mark, both in rented tuxedos, engaged in a visibly tense conversation with two members of the event staff. "I'm telling you, we have tickets," Mark was saying, his voice carrying the particular strained patience of a man used to getting his way through persistence. "There's clearly been some mistake with the list. Sir, I've checked twice. Your names aren't on tonight's confirmed guest list. I'm happy to have someone from the foundation office follow up Monday, but I can't admit you without." That was when Chitty spotted Adaeze approaching, and his expression shifted into something that mixed relief and irritation in equal measure.
"Adaeze."
"Good. Maybe you can help. There's some issue with our tickets. They're saying we're not on the list." "The Ashford Foundation gala is invitation only," he said, half to the staff member, half to her, as though repeating the rule might will it into working in his favor. Then, glancing at her, something in his expression sharpened. "Wait, how are you even getting in? You weren't at the wedding this afternoon in anything close to that. Are you actually on some list?" Mark, catching the exchange, laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with the particular careless confidence of a man who'd never once considered the possibility that his younger cousin might occupy a room he couldn't access. "Not everyone belongs in these rooms, Chitty. I'm sure Adaeze just came to see if she could talk her way into." "No offense, Adaeze, it's just, this is a serious crowd tonight." Adaeze stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the particular, familiar sting of being underestimated by people who shared her blood, a sting that 7 years of professional accomplishment had dulled, but never fully erased. She thought about correcting them immediately, about simply stating the plain fact of her position, and ending the confusion in a single sentence. She found, in the moment, that she didn't especially want to. She said nothing. She stepped past them toward the ballroom entrance, where the staff member, recognizing her immediately, straightened. "Dr. Nwosu, good evening. They've been holding your seat. The head table's set whenever you're ready." Mark's laugh died somewhere in his throat. She'd barely crossed the threshold into the ballroom, chandeliers throwing warm light across 300 round tables, a low hum of pre-dinner conversation, the particular electric quiet of a room waiting for its keynote speaker, when she saw Richard Ashford break away from a cluster of trustees near the stage and begin crossing the entire length of the ballroom floor, ignoring, with the specific deliberateness of a man who never did anything by accident, every hand extended toward him. Along the way, he stopped in front of her, both hands taking hers warmly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the small cluster of guests near the entrance, including, unmistakably, her brother and cousin, still standing at the door with the event staff, watching. "I didn't think you'd make it," Richard said. "Weddings run long. I saved your seat at the head table, next to me. I wasn't going to give the keynote without you in the room. 7 years, Adaeze. You more than earned that seat." Adaeze felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a moment she hadn't engineered, but that had arrived anyway, precisely because she'd spent 7 years building something real rather than performing, something impressive. She glanced back toward the entrance, where Chitty's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from watching an entire evening's assumptions collapse in real time, and said, simply, "Head table." "Thank you, Richard." "Are those two with you?" Richard asked, following her glance toward the entrance, where Mark and Chitty still stood, frozen. "They can join us if you'd like. Always room for family." Adaeze considered it for a moment, the impulse toward a bigger, more theatrical vindication, the kind she might have wanted years earlier, and found, standing there in the dress she'd worn to the dinner where Richard had first called her indispensable in front of a room of people who mattered, that she didn't need the theater nearly as much as she'd once imagined she would. "They're not on the list, Richard," she said. "I think it's fine if they're not." 2 words. "Not tonight," she'd almost said, softer, but what actually left her mouth, quiet and clear enough to carry the small distance to where Chitty stood, was simpler than that. "Family friends," she said, gesturing lightly toward the door staff, a phrase that landed with far more weight than its plainness suggested, because it meant, to anyone actually listening, that she'd chosen, deliberately, not to claim them. Chitty's face went, if possible, a shade paler than it already was. Richard, sensing correctly that something complicated had just passed between Adaeze and the two men at the door, didn't push further. He simply guided her toward the head table with a gentle hand at her elbow, leaving Chitty and Mark standing at the entrance with the same event staff, who now regarded them with the polite, unmistakable indifference reserved for people who had, moments earlier, insisted rather forcefully that a mistake had been made. Adaeze spent the next 2 hours at the head table beside Richard Ashford, seated among Foundation trustees, 2 sitting members of Congress, and a handful of philanthropic leaders who greeted her by name and asked genuine, informed questions about the Housing Policy Division's latest initiative, a world Adaeze had built, quietly and completely, in the 7 years since a graduate school memo had crossed the desk of a man who happened to be bored during a long board meeting. Richard's keynote, when it came, was substantial, 20 minutes on the Foundation's housing work, delivered with the specific credibility of a man who'd actually read the underlying research rather than skimmed a briefing document. Near the end, he'd paused, glanced toward the head table, and said, "I want to acknowledge someone specifically tonight. The Housing Policy Division this foundation is proudest of exists because one woman decided 7 years ago that policy shouldn't just sound good on paper, it should survive contact with the actual lives it's meant to serve. Dr. Adaeze Nwosu runs that division today, and I would not trade her judgment for anyone else's in this field. Adaeze, would you stand?" She stood, briefly, into a room of applause that felt, for the first time that evening, entirely uncomplicated. No family calculus underneath it, no comparison to Chitty's partnership or Mark's client roster, just a room of people who'd watched her work for years and recognized, plainly, what it had built. She didn't see Chitty and Mark again that night. She learned later, through Priya, that they'd left shortly after the confrontation at the door, Mark visibly rattled by the loss of the favor he'd spent a year cultivating to get tickets he never used, Chitty quieter, more shaken, working through something Adaeze suspected went deeper than simple embarrassment. It was 3 days later, back home, that Chitty called her alone, no bravado in his voice, something rawer underneath it than she'd heard from him in years. "I've been trying to figure out what to say since Saturday," he said. "And I keep landing on the same thing, which is that I've spent our whole adult lives assuming I understood what your career was, and I clearly didn't understand any of it." "No," Adaeze said, gently, but without softening the truth of it. "You didn't. Why didn't you ever tell us? About Ashford, about all of it. 7 years, Adaeze. 7 years, and I found out standing at a door being turned away by event staff while you walked past me like I was a stranger. I tried early on. I remember telling you at Mom's 50th birthday that I'd gotten a research position with the Ashford Foundation, and you asked if it paid better than the call center job, and when I said not really, not yet, you moved on to talking about your bar results." Adaeze kept her voice steady, the same steadiness she brought to difficult legislative negotiations, though something in her chest had gone tight in the old familiar way. After a while, it just got easier not to keep offering something that never seemed to land. You'd already decided what my work was worth, and correcting that assumption over and over got exhausting. Chitty was quiet for a long moment. "Mom's housing situation, growing up. That's part of why you do this work, isn't it?" "I never once connected that." "It's most of why I do this work," Adaeze said, surprised by the sudden thickness in her own throat. "You were 12 when Dad left. You don't really remember the 4 years after, the waitlists, the caseworkers who lost our paperwork twice. I remember all of it. I built an entire career trying to make sure fewer people have to live through what she lived through. And you've spent a decade describing that work to relatives as something with nonprofits, like it's a hobby I haven't outgrown yet. I didn't know how to explain to people what you actually did. I'm not sure I understood it myself." "You could have asked," Adaeze said. "In 7 years, nobody in this family asked me a real question about my work. Not what the foundation actually does, not what my division has built, not why a man like Richard Ashford would fly to Detroit on 4 hours' notice for a woman he'd worked with for 2 years at that point. You just assumed because it didn't look like your kind of success that it wasn't real." Chitty didn't have an immediate response to that, and Adaeze let the silence sit rather than rushing to fill it, understanding, from years of watching people absorb difficult truths in policy negotiations and family kitchens alike, that some realizations needed room to breathe before they could be spoken aloud. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That's not enough, I know. But I am." "It's a start," Adaeze said, and meant it, though she understood, even as she said it, that a single phone call wasn't going to undo a decade of assumption, and that some of what had been lost in those years, the ordinary, unremarkable moments where her family might have simply known her, asked about her work with real curiosity, celebrated her alongside Chitty instead of after him, wasn't coming back, no matter how many honest phone calls followed. The months after the gala didn't resolve into anything as clean as full reconciliation. Chitty made a genuine, visible effort, asked real questions now, followed up on details she mentioned, even attended a foundation panel Adaeze spoke on that spring, sitting quietly in the third row and telling her afterward, with something like wonder in his voice, that he'd had no real sense of the scale of what she oversaw until he'd watched her field questions from a room of policy experts with total, easy command. Mark never called at all. Adaeze heard, through Priya, that he'd spent weeks quietly furious about the lost favor, the wasted tickets, the humiliation of being turned away at a door his cousin walked through without a second glance, and that his fury had, over time, calcified into a kind of resentful distance that Adaeze suspected wouldn't thaw easily, if ever. She found, examining her own feelings about that she wasn't especially troubled by the loss. Some relationships, she'd learned over the years, weren't worth the effort of repair, and Mark's had never offered her much beyond the specific comparison and condescension he delivered so casually at the door. Her mother, when she finally heard the full story, pieced together slowly, over several conversations, since Adaeze had never found the right moment to deliver it all at once, had cried, quietly on the phone, not from shock exactly, but from something that sounded, to Adaeze, like a particular grief for the years she hadn't fully understood her daughter's life, layered under real pride in what that life had become. "You built all of this out of what happened to us," her mother said. "Out of me and those years, and I never once asked you what it actually meant to you to be doing this work. You were surviving those years, Mom. You didn't have room to ask me anything. I understand that now more than I did at 25. I have room now." "I know," Adaeze said. "I'll take you up on that." Adaeze kept running the Foundation's housing division with the same quiet, exacting discipline that had built it, expanding the program that year into 2 additional states, testifying before a Senate subcommittee for the first time in her career, a moment she found herself wishing, briefly and without bitterness, that more of her family had been in the room to witness. She kept her Thursday dinners with Marcus and 2 other colleagues from the early years of the fellowship, a standing tradition that had outlasted 3 different restaurants and had become one of the steadiest friendships of her adult life. She started, that fall, mentoring a first-year graduate student whose research memo had crossed her desk in almost the exact way her own had crossed Richard's 7 years earlier, a small, deliberate act of paying forward the specific kind of attention that had changed the entire shape of her life. Richard remained, as he had for 7 years, a fixture of her life in ways that went beyond the professional, a call on her birthday, a standing invitation to his family's Thanksgiving that she took him up on more years than not, a mentor who had become, in every way that mattered except biology, closer to family than the family she'd been born into had managed to be for most of her adult life. She thought, sometimes, about the strange arithmetic of that fact, that the man who'd flown to Detroit for her mother's hospitalization had done so more readily, more instinctively, than her own brother had ever managed to ask a real question about her work. She thought, some evenings, about the 2 words that had made Chitty's face go pale at the ballroom door, family friends, and the particular quiet power of having finally, after 7 years, stopped needing her blood family's recognition in order to know exactly what she'd built. She didn't regret saying it. But she noticed, in the months afterward, a grief she hadn't fully anticipated, not for the moment of vindication itself, which had felt, in the end, more hollow than she'd expected, but for everything underneath it, the years she might have had with a brother who actually knew her, if either of them had found the courage to ask the right question a decade earlier. She didn't know if Chitty's effort would deepen into something permanent, or if Mark's silence would ever thaw, or if her mother's newfound room to ask questions would fully close the distance built over so many quiet years of assumption. She suspected some of it wouldn't resolve completely, that she'd carry the memory of that ballroom threshold with her for a long time, not as a wound exactly, but as a permanent, quiet marker of the night. She stopped waiting at doors her family had decided she didn't belong behind, and walked, instead, straight to the seat that had been saved for her all along. That felt like something worth sitting with rather than resolving. She let it sit,